There was once a girl who lived in a shack by the sea with her father. Her father was a fisherman, but, well, he was also quite lazy and he didn't go out fishing very often, which meant that they had enough to eat, but only just, and they certainly did not have enough to sell and make money from. And so the girl, well, she would go down to the shore in the morning and she would forage. She would look for mussels and clams and anything that she could find to sell at market later that day. This particular morning she went down to the shore, and there in one of the rock pools was a large fish with golden eyes and green fins and red spots all over its body. She'd never seen a fish like this before, and so she went over, and it was struggling to breathe. And so she scooped it up and took it down to the sea and placed it into the water where it swam away. And before it disappeared, it turned and it looked at her and said, "I am a magic fish. Please call me whenever you need to make a wish." And with that, it turned and it sank below the waves. Now the girl thought this was amazing. She'd seen a magic fish. How incredible was that? And so she finished her foraging and she went back to the cottage and she told her father what had happened. "You stupid girl," said her dad. "You should have asked it for a wish. Just think, here we are living in a shack. We could be living somewhere nice. Go back and tell that fish that you want a house." And so the girl, well, she went back down to the shore. She hadn't thought about really asking for a wish, but she got there and she thought, well, it's a magic fish. I should probably say something magical. And so she took a deep breath and said, magic fish, I saved your life. Now hear my wish." And the sea gently bubbled, and there appeared the fish, and it said, "Certainly, how can I help you?" And the girl said, "Well, my father says we should have somewhere nice to live. Could we get a cottage with roses round the door and a garden to grow vegetables in?" "Of course," said the fish. "Go home, it is there." And so the girl turned and she went home. And there, instead of the shack, was a cottage, the prettiest cottage you have ever seen. It had roses growing round the door and vegetable patches and flowers growing everywhere. And the girl was delighted. For a while, even her father seemed happy. But after a few months, she came down to breakfast one morning and her father was scowling. "I've been thinking," he said. "That magic fish, we should have made more. We should have asked for more. Go back and tell him we want to live in a castle and I want to be king." The girl did not like the sound of this at all. She loved her cottage, she loved the roses growing round the door, and she loved the vegetable patches and the hens that she'd managed to get from market. But she finally went down to the shore and she stood there and she thought for a while, and then she shouted, magic fish, I saved your life. Please grant my wish." And the fish appeared and the sea bubbled and boiled a little more than it had done last time. And the fish said, "Hello again, what do you want?" And the girl said, "Well, to be fair, I'm quite happy, but my father, well, he wants to live in a castle and to be king." And the magic fish looked at her for a moment and said, "And is this what you're asking me for?" And the girl reluctantly said, "Yes." And so the fish nodded and said, "Go home. Your father is now in the castle." And the girl went home, and there was a castle. It was enormous, a big, huge, enormous castle. And they had servants to wait on them, and her father sat on a throne. And he seemed quite happy. Maybe not. She couldn't really tell. So she picked up a ball and went for a walk through the grounds of the castle. It was okay for a few weeks. But then one day her father summoned her to the throne room and said, "I have been thinking. Being king is all very well, but I want to be emperor. I want to be emperor of many, many lands. Go back down and tell the fish that I want to be emperor and live in the biggest palace you have ever seen." And so the girl went back down to the shore, and she hesitated for quite a while, not really sure that this was the right thing to ask for, but feeling that she needed to ask anyway. And so she shouted, magic fish, I saved your life. Please grant my wish." And the sea turned black and bubbled and boiled, and eventually there appeared the fish with the golden eyes. "What do you want?" it said this time. "More wishes?" And the girl nodded and said, "Well, my father is not happy. He wants to be emperor of many, many lands and live in the world's biggest palace." The fish looked at her for a long time and said, "Okay, it is done. Go home. Your father is in the palace." And the girl turned sadly and walked home. And there, in place of the cottage, in place of the castle, in place of their shack, there was the most enormous palace you have ever seen. There were courtyards, there were buildings here, there, and everywhere. It was shining and shimmering and looked impressive. And there was her father sitting on the most enormous throne you have ever seen. It was made of gold and encrusted with rubies and diamonds, and he sat with a ball of wisdom in one hand and a scepter in the other hand. And people came to him with all their problems, and he quite enjoyed getting to decide everyone's fate. The people were not overly happy because he was not always wise and he was not always kind, but he decided the fates of many, many people. One day he decided that he needed more power, though, and he summoned his daughter to the throne room. And as she entered, he said, "Ah, daughter, I have been thinking about this, and being emperor of many, many lands is interesting enough. But I have been thinking, I want to control the sun and the moon and the stars themselves and get the ocean to do my bidding. Go and tell that fish I want to be ruler of all the universe." Now the daughter felt dismayed at this, and she tried to reason with her father. She tried to explain that perhaps this was not the best course of action, but he would not hear about it. He insisted that she had to go back down to the shore and tell the fish that he wanted to be ruler of everything. And so the girl, she went to her room, and she sat on her bed, and she thought about their life in the shack and in the cottage and the castle and in the palace, and now going back down to the shore. And what did she want? What did she really want? Never mind what her father wanted. And so she walked back down to the shore, and she stood there looking at the waves. And as she looked at the waves, she shouted, magic fish, I spared your life. Please grant me a wish." And the fish appeared, and the sea boiled and bubbled, and black hissing steam rose from it. And the fish looked at her with its big round golden eyes and said, "Well, what is it this time?" And the girl said, My father wants to be ruler of everything. He wants to rule the universe. He wants to rule the oceans and the waves and the stars and the moon and the sun and everything in all of creation." Said the fish. "And how do you feel about this?" And the girl stopped and put up her hand and said, "I do not want this to happen. I do not think this is fair. I do not think this is the way that things are meant to be. I think my father should be back in the shack, and I think I should go off to seek my fortune." And the fish smiled, and the sea calmed and went flat as a mill pond, and the sun seemed brighter than it had before. And the fish nodded and said yes, I think this sounds like a better idea. Your father is back in the shack, and you shall go on to have many adventures, and you shall find out what it is to live in the world. Pick up your bag. It is full of everything you will ever need, and go. Go and live the life that you want to live. And the girl picked up her bag and smiled and said thank you and wished the fish well, and she turned and she walked off into the distance to seek new adventure and a new beginning.